Welcome back to Battle Plan, a podcast focused on spiritual warfare. I'm Dr. Charli, and I have a story today that you don't want to miss. Redeemed from the LGBT lie. This is my new friend, Lyndsey, and she is from Arkansas. And I am so proud, Lyndsey, to have you on the podcast with me today. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So Lyndsey is a stay-at-home mom. She has a great husband and a new baby. Your baby's 2 months old?
He is 18 weeks. He's 3 months.
Gosh, 3 months old. So Lyndsey has this amazing testimony. And there's really no way that I can introduce it other than just to let her share her story. But I want to preface it with this. I know some family that live, some of Lyndsey's family, and this young woman was raised in the church. You probably never got to leave.
No, we opened and we closed.
Right? And I mean, we're talking not just parents, we're talking generations of people who love and serve the Lord. And so that being said, Lyndsey, tell us your story.
Well, like you said, I was born and raised in church. I have quite a legacy family, very rich heritage in the church. But sometime around age 14 or 15, I befriended an older student in the youth group who introduced me to some new thoughts and feelings that I was not prepared for. She professed some feelings for me and confessed some affection and loving feelings for me that I didn't even know were really possible. That was not a notion that I had even knew was possible.
This is the church youth group.
Yes, church youth group. And she was several years older than me. So I thought she was cool and older and
Right.
and I hadn't started high school quite yet. So I really looked up to her in that sense. And anyways, so that relationship introduced the idea of a lesbian or homosexual relationship. Not a lot happened during that relationship, but I think it's important just at the age that happened at. It's a very kind of pivotal moment in your teenage experience where you're starting to develop crushes and you're boy curious and you're experimenting with feelings and things because you've not entered into those kind of relationships yet. And you're starting to, hormones, teenagers. And I think this relationship really kind of distorted the experience that I should have had as a 14 or 15-year-old and had to navigate some harder waters and more difficult feelings and experiences than a kid should have to at that age. I went through a very hard time. It was very hard on me in that it was a very small rural town, very hard time in that church. When that relationship kind of came to light, I kind of became a pariah a little bit, and to the extent that like parents wouldn't let their kids hang out with me or sit with me at church. And of course, this didn't affect the older friend because she had gone on to college. So she wasn't around for any of this, but I experienced a lot of exclusion and things, which is also very hard for, a 14, 15-year-old kid.
Yeah.
So desperate to try to get out of that kind of situation, I wound up moving in with my dad and stepmom and moved to a new town and tried to move on from that. And there I got to experience a lot of new things in their church and really did try to move on from it. But I was doing it on my parents knew what was going on, but didn't know what to do, didn't know how to handle it.
Right.
They were putting me, in church all of the time. They were on staff and there was a great youth group there. I was starting to make friends and things were in my line of sight kind of turning a corner, but that was always looming in the back of my head as some kind of like dark secret that I could just never get rid of. And then after high school, I wound up in master's commission programs. Highly do not recommend.
Can you explain what that is?
Sure. They're advertised as discipleship programs where they offer hands-on ministry experience. They offer like one-on-one discipleship with their leaders and pastors of that church in that area. They want you to go to other churches and minister, but what you wind up really doing is being a lot of free labor, really, for the churches that they're a part of, or there were different things that they would call ministry, but really it was not exactly that. The staff had, I think, informed my parents that they would be able to offer specific counseling for the issues that I was dealing with. And that in time, looking back, because years later, I found out that the staff members who they were referring to had actually been in that lifestyle before and then continued to live that lifestyle later. So
Wow.
I don't think you can receive counseling from someone who is also struggling with the same issues, you're just trying to keep their heads above water. I don't know where they are
Especially not
now.
if they're still active in their sin.
And I don't know that they were at the time I was there,
Right.
but if you're actively struggling with it, I don't think, it's really wise to give counsel to someone else who is also struggling. And the most counsel I got was they gave me a book and never talked to me about it again. So that's just specific to my experience with that. But the experience overall, it was very expensive. And I have very strange memories from that time. It just, there was, I don't feel like I got anything beneficial out of it. I
Wow.
met some great people who are now in ministry and doing great things in different states. But most people, I think, did not have a very great experience. So, but that's what it is. They advertise it as a discipleship program
So
and
what happened
kind
after
of
that?
after that, I left master's commission and moved back home and moved out on my own. And within like that year or two, I started to live openly in another state. I moved states to pursue a relationship and remained there for a total of 8 years, I think.
Okay.
So in total, it's probably 10 years. I call it the dark decade.
Okay. All right. That's a good name for it. The dark decade.
Yeah. So we met a part of 10 years, did that eventually towards the end there, around that 8-year mark. I did marry another woman. That marriage lasted just a couple years. And I didn't really have a great experience the whole time I was trying to do this. Sometime before when I returned home from master's commission and before I decided to just move out on my own, I did try to kind of pray through what I was dealing with because, again, I just couldn't shake what I was experiencing. And for me, it wasn't so much same sex attraction, or it was simply that what I felt, I guess, that I was tomboyish and not the prettiest of gals, and I wasn't super feminine per se. And boys didn't chase me like they chased my friends. And so, but the only attention I ever really got in a romantic sense were from other girls. And I think that combined with the experiences that I had before kind of made me start to think and ponder, well, if that's the case and boys aren't interested in me and girls are, maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I should pursue that.
Okay.
You look like you have a question.
No, I'm
Okay.
just processing. I love what you're saying. I don't want, I wish you had not had to go through that story, but it resonates with me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think it probably resonates with a lot of folks. But I did try to pray through in that in between time, and I could give I don't know that I've ever settled on an actual reason why I don't know if I thought that God would I think at the time I thought God wasn't answering me. So indifference from him meant indifference from me. And then later, I think at one point I was like, okay, well, maybe he answered and I just didn't want to hear it. And so I never really got a clear answer
Okay.
during that time. And so I just forged ahead to try to live that lifestyle. And yeah, I was still very young and I couldn't tell you exactly what I prayed or, even felt like God said or may have not said or if anything happened and I just missed it or what. But at the time, it wasn't enough to convince me to.
So why got you to the point where you were done with that lifestyle?
At the end of it all, I had just started to look back over. the woman that I was married to at the time, I very much wanted to start a family, and I was trying to find a way to do that. We had discussed some different things and had kind of agreed, but it just seemed like things were not happening, and thank God they didn't. But at that time, and so I was just reflecting over like the last decade of my life and just feeling very dissatisfied with it, with what I had accomplished. I hated my job. I hated where we lived, and I wasn't happy in our relationship, and I just felt very unfulfilled. And so eventually I was going to work one day and I was just angry. And so I just started yelling at God to and from work
Oh,
because
I've
it was
done that.
haven't we all? We've all been there once or twice. I just was angry and because I was very unfulfilled and nothing, there wasn't a part of my life that I enjoyed. I was very depressed. I was in a lot of physical pain too and self-medicating for that. And so to and from work was basically the only time I was alone. So I just decided if I was going to yell at God, maybe I needed to do that by myself. And because I don't know how you explain that to your same sex spouse. But
Yeah.
anyway, I to and from work for a couple days, I yelled at God and I couldn't tell you all of what I said, but I'm sure I just expressed how dissatisfied and how upset I was. And yelling turned into talking and talking at him, not with him, but at him. I de-escalated a
And we
little
all have
bit.
to start somewhere.
Yeah. Went from yelling to talking. We de-escalated a little bit. And after about 2 weeks, I came home one day and I was by myself and I sat down on my bed and I just decided to pray and actually pray and not just talk at him. And I said a form of a sinner's prayer. It wasn't your typical you know, uh,
Right.
repeat after me kind of prayer. It was more like, God, I'm exhausted and I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to feel this way anymore. I know who you are. And if you can really do anything, if you will completely 180 my life, I will walk away from everything. I'll walk away from this relationship. I'll walk away from this state. I'll walk away from my job. I'll go anywhere you want me to, but I have to get out. I don't want to do this anymore, but you have to change me because I don't think I can do this anymore. And and he did. And the reason I know he did is because in that moment I felt the same way as I did when I was 7 years old. The very first time I got saved, I was in the car with my biological mom and we were talking about Jesus dying on the cross. And I was very moved. I was a very sensitive kid, still a very
Right.
sensitive adult, but I was very moved by Jesus dying on the cross. And so she helped me say such a sinner's prayer. And the feeling that I got, I told her I had butterflies in my tummy. And the feeling that I had in that moment at 34, 32, something like that, was exactly what I felt at 7 years old. So I knew exactly what had happened. I knew that I had absolutely gotten saved. And I was like, okay, if you're holding up your end of the bargain, I'll hold up mine. So I called my dad and told him what had just happened. And he said, okay. And we started to plan where to go from here and how to get me out of there. Of course, that took a little bit of time in planning because I was uprooting my whole life. And that night, I also had to, confront my spouse and try to explain what just happened to someone who had no, foundation or understanding of salvation or what a relationship with Jesus looks like. And in that, particular community, they poke fun at people who find Jesus, you know. And so I don't think she believed me initially, but she sure did when I left. But we had a very hard conversation and I lay down that night to go to sleep and I just prayed before I fell asleep and just said, God, you've saved me and I've agreed to, follow through on my end of the deal, but I don't know how to do this because at this point I had never done it before. I'd not lived as an adult for Jesus. I had not, tried to pursue any other lifestyle. I
Yeah.
didn't know if it was even possible. So I went to sleep that night and God gave me a dream, and I dreamed that I was in the back seat of a car and there was a man driving, and I knew that man was my husband. I couldn't see his face, but I knew that's who he was to me, like, things in dreams. And to my left was a car seat with a 6-month-old baby boy in it. And about the time I got done fawning over the beautiful baby boy in that car seat, Mammy texted me, his more or less mom, my stepmom's mom, her grandmother, my grandmother, and she texted me and said,
No, you're dreaming. This is the middle of
"I'm dreaming. Yes, this is a dream."
okay, wow, and it's the middle of the night.
Yep, middle of the night,
Wow,
I'm
okay.
completely asleep. She texted me in my dream and asked
Oh,
how
she
we were.
texted you in the dream.
Yes,
Okay.
in the
Okay.
dream, and asked me how we were making it on our journey, and I said we were doing good. So and so, my husband is doing all the driving, and baby is sleeping soundly or something. And she said husband's name. It wasn't visible to me, but she called him by name and said, which I believe God withheld from me, because if I had known his name, I would have been looking for him. I wouldn't have wanted to date anybody whose name wasn't that.
Right.
So she said he was so precious and she was so glad that we found each other and she couldn't wait to see the baby. Fast forward just a little bit, so I woke up just, Lord, I'm getting a little tongue tied here. I woke up feeling a little more reassured, and I wrote down in the notes in my phone the entire dream and just held on to it as, a promise that
Yeah. Yeah.
that that could happen. And so I moved to Arkansas and moved in with my parents and was prepared to start over, and then COVID happened and the entire world
The
shuts
whole
down.
world started
The
over.
whole world stopped. And you would think that would have been just a kinda kick in the knees that, you've uprooted your whole life and then this, virus takes out life as we know it, just the normality is no more. And I reaped so much blessing and benefit from COVID. Just during that, I wound up stuck in a house with my family all over again. And for the first time since I was 17, 18. And I think that it gave us first and foremost an opportunity to reconnect and relearn each other and be in close quarters, because though I was still me, I was the me that they hadn't known in a very long time.
Yeah.
And I was a me that I hadn't known in a very long time, and they had all grown up. And so it took some time, and we spent a lot of time together, and I don't know that they would all look so fondly back on that time being stuck in that house together, but for me, it was very, very much needed. And then from everything that should have been bad, from, unemployment and stimulus checks and things, I was able to have enough money to pay off the little debt I have and find an apartment and find furniture and fill my fridge and pay bills, which I wouldn't have been able to do for a very long time had I not just gotten a little chunk. So what should have been a very hard time, I think actually, was exactly what I needed to. God found a way to provide for me through that.
Wow.
After that, it wasn't but just a couple years later, I met my husband, and we dated for a little while and then decided to get married. And then we started trying to have a family with not a whole lot of success, but 3 years later, we have our bouncing baby boy, which
That's
is the fulfillment to my entire dream that
yes.
was over 6 years ago. So
That's
that's where we
amazing.
are
That's
today.
beautiful. So I love your story because it touches on so many things. I would love to go back for a moment
Sure.
to the early years. Do you think that there was a demonic assignment on you? Do you think that there is a demonic assignment on our youth with this sin, this alternative lifestyle, that whole, you know, homosexuality, lesbianism, bi-curiousness, all this stuff? Do you think it's an assignment?
I mean, sure. I mean, the ultimate vendetta of the enemy is
Right.
to
I mean,
disrupt.
just wondering if looking back, did you feel targeted?
In a way, I would say yes, because if I had continued to live that lifestyle, my son wouldn't exist, and my husband and I never would have met. And
You said something before we went on the air that I think
sure.
is really pivotal, and that is that this is the enemy's way of preventing family.
Yeah, it's an absolute attack on your basic identity, just as you're in yourself and in the, divine design of who we are supposed to be. He has attacked it at its core. We are designed a particular way for a reason, and not to just clash into gender roles, but there is balance in the way in the original design. It was
Yeah.
designed that way for a reason. And in these relationships, a lot of times I think that people start to seek to, even unknowingly, to try to restore a sort of balance to it because their life has been their identity has been so distorted, so they
Yeah.
start to seek out, certain aspects of
So,
what
Lindsay, tell
should
me about,
be.
because, we talked about this. You grew up in the church. And so there was no lack of word in your life. There's no lack of talk of Jesus and God and scriptures and Holy Spirit and all those things in your life. But yet, when you started, and you said this, when you started pursuing relationships that were out of God's plan, there wasn't a really tremendous response from the church. Can you talk about that? Is the church ill equipped?
I think so. I think the church is more equipped today than it has been before. The church has started to talk about these things because this lifestyle has become such a prevalent thing in just our culture.
It's in our face.
It's
It's
everywhere.
everywhere.
You can't watch a single show, movie, news report without something from the queer community being included. Even if it's become frustrating to me, even if it's just a token character that has no benefit to the plot or storyline at all. There's no reason to bring it in or mention it. It can be very frustrating if that's you're trying to avoid, especially
Yeah.
filtering things for your kids. But you'll have to remind me, I've lost
But
what
well,
our original
we're
question
talking about the
was.
church.
Oh,
How
yes, the
is the church
church.
handling?
Yes, I think the church is more equipped today than they have been, but for so long, the church refused to talk about it. There was a long point
I think
for
it's
a
kind of
few.
ostracized.
Yeah, yeah, they were. I mean, people would, get beat up or, very badly wounded just for being known to be associated with this particular lifestyle for many decades. And then all of a sudden there was a shift and it started becoming more of the norm in our culture and started become a more prevalent and accepted thing.
Yeah.
And as that happened, and it was no longer such a hush hush thing that you didn't talk about, I think the church,
Yeah.
fell prey
There's a
to a
reason
very,
they call it coming out.
yeah, yeah. But I think the church fell prey to, a very religious spirit and, because they had held on to this, we don't talk about it for so long, they didn't know how to deal with it. When they started being confronted with families who had family members who were going through it or individuals were seeking, advice or counsel for things that they were experiencing, they didn't have any foundation for it, which I think to me just in general is very sad because it's not like this is a new sin. This sin is mentioned in the Bible
Bingo.
numerous times with every other sin. All these things that God says not to do, sexual immorality is right in there with them all. This is not a new thing. And to me,
I mean, it's
that's just
one of the
kind
whole
of
reasons Noah had to build an ark.
right. It's just very sad to me because if you're so freaked out by this, what are you doing? Because have you read anything? Because sin is
The
the same,
Bible.
salvation is the same, the word is the same.
Right.
You should know how to confront this. Just because it has a different mask doesn't mean you treat it any differently. You still have to
Yeah.
treat it.
So let's talk about this for a second on a practical level,
Sure. Yeah.
because I have at the ministry calls every week from parents, grandparents, aunties who are desperate to understand what's happening with their child. They love them. They have never quit loving them, but they can't agree with the lifestyle. And so often there are so many things that come with the lifestyle. You said that, it's almost a point of accusation or a point of uh, mockery when somebody in the queer community comes to know Jesus because, or, aligns with Christianity. They make fun of them. Well, a lot of times the family members are being attacked and accused because they quote unquote won't accept the lifestyle. They love the person, but the queer community wants them to accept the whole lifestyle. And they just struggle with doing that because they feel like it goes against every principle of God's word. How would you approach that with these families? What would you tell them?
I think it's a very hard line to toe because you know the truth and the family member you're dealing with is very deceived. You're not going to see it the way you see it,
Right.
and you're not going to see it the way they see it because you're not deceived. And you can't be accepting of as much as you want to be a part of their lives. I think you should be a part of their lives as much as you can be. You need to love these people. You need to exemplify Jesus. You need to,
Yes.
you know, you still have to, and you do, especially if they're, your kids. You're going to look at it and think, what did I do wrong? And you can't not love them because they're your kids and you don't wanna let go, and I don't think that you should,
And
but
you
I
don't want to
think
quit loving them.
yeah. So, you can't stop loving them, but you ultimately, you can't accept their lifestyle or certain things that they're going to be involved with because you put yourself in agreement with the spirit they're being deceived by, and ultimately, that just keeps them bound, and, your
It's
prayers will
just
hit a
hard.
ceiling. It
It's
is, but
just
your prayers will
hard.
absolutely hit a ceiling because you are in agreement with the spirit that they're being deceived by, and
So that's interesting. You're cautioning everyone not to love the person, but be very careful about coming into agreement or entertaining or accepting their lifestyle choices, because once you come into agreement with the spirit that has deceived them, then your prayers will hit a ceiling and they won't be answered.
yeah, well, I just believe that can I'm not saying that maybe not be answered, but I do think you're kinda working against yourself there if you're
That's
if
so,
you're
whoa, girl, that's some
if
wisdom
you're
there.
if you're allowing it to take place,
Yeah.
then it's to me, it's no different than, watching The Exorcist. If you watch The Exorcist, then you're inviting demons into your household and they absolutely have a right to be there
That's
because you
really
allowed
good.
it.
I really love that. You're so right, because this is like the newest sin, even though you said very clearly
Yeah,
it's not
it's
new.
it's not,
It's just more in our face than it has been in several centuries. And so we're facing it fresh and new. The church, like you said, the church finally has to face this, and we're struggling with how to do that. But I love, you believed a lie, that they've been deceived. And I think, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I believe it all starts with believing a lie.
it
You
does.
alluded to, I didn't think I was attractive to boys. I didn't think they found me attractive. Well, that was a lie. That was a deception that you believed. And then here we are, and we're trying to navigate this. But really, why do people become addicted to gambling?
Yeah.
Why do people become addicted to pornography or drugs or alcohol? There's a lie somewhere that they have believed. This will make me feel better. This will take care of my money problems.
Yeah.
This will make me feel attractive again. I mean,
Yeah, just to clarify though, I did. have several crushes on boys to start about that age when all of that happened.
Yeah.
I was interested in boys, but that initial relationship, that friendship, I think it just skewed what I thought I knew, because then the things that I wanted to experience with a boy were coming from, a girl instead,
Right.
and it made me
Talk about
question.
confusing.
Yeah, especially for a 14, 15-year-old kid.
So, Lindsay, what would you say to parents who have children this age? If they find themselves in a place like your parents did where their child is experimenting or, curious about this lifestyle, or maybe they're approached by somebody and these parents are now dealing with this situation. What would you tell them? How would you coach them as a parent?
I don't know. I've very recently become a parent myself, and my husband and I have had to have several conversations about how we're going to approach things with our son, because I don't think we are in a place anymore where you can pretend it doesn't exist. You can't shelter your kids anymore. You can, what we keep saying is, we want to protect him from the evils of the world, but we know that we can't. And all that we can really do is equip and try to prepare him to deal with it on his own. And we have talked about it at length. And I think that if this is just the strategy we've talked about, of course, he's just 3 months old. We're not having
Right.
conversations yet. And, we may
But
change up
you
our
were that
plan.
child that was targeted, so I feel like you have a better grasp on how to coach a parent.
Yeah. I think we've just agreed to have age appropriate conversations with him, because I don't, we don't know where he's going to go to school, but at some point he's going to encounter somebody who has, two moms or two dads or two uncles or whatever. And I don't want that to catch him off guard. I don't
Okay.
want that to be something that he has to try to figure out on his own. And I don't want it to be a conversation that's closed off to us, or and not that it was with my parents, I just didn't know it was a thing. I didn't know it was something we
Right.
needed to
You were
talk
so
about.
sheltered that it was, yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't know it was a
And
thing.
I don't
When
mean
it
sheltered in a negative sense,
Right,
just protected.
right. And
Yeah.
and be and, like, I had I had 3 parents, and all 3 of them loved me as fiercely as they could, and raised me in church, and did what they thought, to be right, as every parent does. But we were still in an age where you just didn't talk about it. For somebody who's already dealing with it, I think a dialogue helps. You're going
Yeah.
to have to be willing to have those hard conversations no matter how icky they might get. You need
Yeah.
to be prepared to talk it through with your kid and have, age appropriate conversations, because if they're, 7 and in first grade and talking to you about, a little girl's 2 moms, then you need to know what to say. And that's hard. I think all you can really do is break it down and just give them biblical truth, and
Yeah.
cover them in prayer.
Let me ask you, do you have any favorite resources that you've come
Um,
across?
I actually really are you familiar with Jackie Hill Perry?
Yes. Right.
I I love her very much. I hope we will be friends one day. Shout out Jackie. But she has a book called Gay Girl, Good God, and I read that book right after I got saved, and it was the first time I felt like I wasn't an island, like I wasn't the only one who had experienced something like that. She has a very clear way of explaining things and wording things that makes it very easy. She was also someone I think she grew up in church a little bit. I think she had a little bit of a background. I don't know the depth of it, but she has a way of explaining things that I have really enjoyed. I actually
Yeah.
first found her on a documentary about sexual sin that someone recommended that I watch, which felt very embarrassing, but it's called The Heart of Man. But it was actually super helpful, and the illustrations in it are just beautiful. I cried through the entire thing. It does a
Wow.
great job of really depicting,
So
being in your
as
pig
you
pen.
were allowing the Holy Spirit to rewrite your identity, because you went down the I'm writing my identity this one way path, and then you backtracked. You said, no, my identity is being rewritten through Christ. Were there scriptures or was there a character in the Bible or their story that just helped you hang on through the tough transitions of re-identifying with Christ?
I think what I have held on to the most has been the dream that God gave me the night I got saved, and so there were some stories that just kinda resonated with me. At some point, I think a couple years after I'd been saved, the Holy Spirit gave me Isaiah 54. I don't know if you're familiar with that chapter, but the first verse is like, "Sing, barren woman, you have not given birth." And it goes on to say, like, "Expand your tents and make room." And I'm gonna cry just talking about it, but for somebody who was so desperate to have their own family and to have a baby, it was very much like an "I see you" Hagar kinda moment, and Hagar's another
God,
story where, she calls God El Roi, the God who sees me. Of course, mine is very centered around my desire for a family, and so all of that I really hung on to. I mean, with Hannah and her
that tells me
desperation
a
for
lot
Samuel.
about what God's purpose is for you, that you are to literally leave the legacy of a God fearing, filled with the word and the spirit family.
I
And
hope that's
I don't just say that because I know your family, but that is, I just feel that that's God's call on your life. And that's why you were attacked in this way because the enemy wanted to prevent that.
yeah, he wanted to blot out my family, and if Charles and I hadn't met, Charles and I had been together for maybe 6 months or so, and he got saved. He very much wanted to know the Lord, but he wasn't raised in church and he just had no foundation for it. And so when we met, he was telling me he wanted to get in church and he was very serious about it. And he wanted actually one of our first dates, we went to a church service together because at the time I was looking for a home church. And so we decided to go to a service together. And it wasn't but a few months later he got saved, and then, of course, just a few years later, we had our son, and is if I had continued to be deceived, Charles would have never gotten saved, and our son would definitely wouldn't have
Wow,
been born.
that's
So,
beautiful.
I just held on to those stories in the Bible, just those scriptures about Hannah and her desperation for Samuel and, even, God's promise to Abraham, but, Sarah laughed. And, these were all seasons that these people went through, and I think it was just my reminder overall that God was faithful in every season, that even when your dream seemed ridiculous and when you were desperate and felt alone and when you felt unheard or unseen, God was still faithful
Yeah.
in all of those seasons.
I would like to go back for a moment
Sure.
to the place where you were talking about how when somebody in the queer community finds Jesus, they get mocked. Can you talk about that just for a minute? Can you help us in the non-queer community who love Jesus understand from the inside perspective why we're mocked?
I mean, I don't think it's much different
Don't
than
spare anyone's feelings. Tell us the truth.
I don't think it's much different than just Christians being mocked in general. The general population isn't fond of Christians at the moment. It's very frowned upon. It's not a popular thing, but didn't Jesus tell us we wouldn't be popular?
Right.
So, it's just more of a joke. Even the way Christians are portrayed on TV, it's so phony and terrible and weird, and we who have experienced it know that it's not like that, but it's made to be more of a joke. A lot of people, I think, in the queer community are people who are deconstructing from faith, who are trying to figure out and find their way, And in that process, they're still just being very deceived. But
And
because they
getting
do,
more and more frustrated when they don't find the solutions outside of Christ.
yes, they really do. And some are, and a lot of it is, a lot of people have just been hurt in not just like abusive situations, but meaning like sexual abuse or emotional or physical abuse, but just church abuse and church hurt.
Yeah.
People have been hurt in the church. And, especially there was a big surge in the queer community with the millennial generation. And, a lot of those people grew up in church. And we're kind of seeing some of the newer, younger generations who are, not entertaining so much of what is transpiring in the queer community these days,
Right.
but who are just wanting everything to be plain and simple and clearly stated. And so I'm kind of hoping maybe we're about to shift and see some light shed on some of these areas and just some of
That's great.
the
Yeah, I
lie that's out
definitely
there.
agree with that. Wow. Okay, Lyndsey, of all the things you've experienced and the knowledge and the wisdom that you've gained through your story, what did I not ask you that I should have?
Trying to see, I made a couple of notes on to make sure I didn't skip anything myself. Man, I don't know. It's such a broad topic that I always feel like I never say quite enough, you know?
Right. So if you were at church on Sunday
Mm.
and a gay couple walks through the door, how would you greet them? How would you have the rest of the church greet them?
I think we've really overthought the way we greet people at church,
Gay?
because
I'm all
for
here.
my whole life, I've really, I've heard that, they always talked about how, if Jesus came to church dressed the way he did when, he was walking around in the biblical days, then, you probably wouldn't let him in because he'd get the carpet dirty. And, I have been in services where there have been homeless people or displaced
Right.
people. And, I have seen people, not at our church currently, but through over years, turn up their noses because people may have not had access to a shower recently or a meal or whatever. And the thing is, our pastor does a brilliant job of the way he says things about welcoming people to our churches. We don't care what you wear, and just
Yeah.
just 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 come because Jesus doesn't care what you wear, and he doesn't care where you're at either.
We have to just love and greet. And that's what
I
I
w-
expect
it,
one.
yeah, I just wouldn't. I am, a very shy kind of withdrawn person anyway, so the greeting people is a little frightening for me. But I wouldn't treat them any different than
Yeah.
anybody else. And I think that's really just the key is that,
Yeah.
you can't treat you just need to be excited that they're there and,
Yeah.
you know, and make them feel welcome without being like, "Do you have a Bible? Let me get you one. Come sit by me." Just but just,
Like indoctrination.
right. This is, not the Church of Scientology where we're gonna lock the doors when you come inside,
Right.
we're just glad that you're there, and we hope that you enjoy what you hear and that you
The
find what you need.
experience, Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Lyndsey, this has been such a fruitful conversation. I'm so grateful that you're willing to share your testimony. And I'm confident that there are going to be so many people that get to hear this and are blessed by it. Would you pray over the families and the people who are experiencing and I think it's really hard to find a single family now that's not got some sort of that they're not touched by the queer community in some way.
Yeah.
Would you just pray for them?
Sure. Jesus, thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to share with Dr. Charlie today. And I just pray that you would be where you've always been, and that's right beside these people. You've never left them. You've never deserted them. You've always been right there. You love them because you love them, because you love them, because you love them. You don't care what color the dirt in their pig pen is. You just care. that they finally realize they're in one and that they need to come home. Father, I just pray that you would remove the scales from their eyes, that you would open their eyes to help them see the deception and the lies of the enemy that they're believing, that you would show them the truth, that you would show them their identity in Christ, that you would show them who you say they are and who you have written down in their books in in heaven many, many years ago, long before they were born. You wrote their stories and just show them the possibility of who they can be and what that they don't have to be so lost and bound. And God, I pray that you would open their eyes to the light of freedom that's presented to the particular people who are struggling with this particular sin. God, that you would show them their chains instead of what's being advertised and shown to them as freedom. And I pray that you would give strength to family members who are praying for their loved ones who are, living this sort of lifestyle. God, I pray that you would fortify their faith, God, that you would help them love and love deeply and love as you would, that you would help them exemplify you to their lost loved ones, that you would give them strength and courage, but most of all, give them peace in their hearts to know that nothing is impossible for you, that nothing is out of your grasp, that nothing has caught you by surprise, that this is nothing new to you. There is nothing too big or too scary that you can't deal with or handle. We thank you that you are who you are, that you are the great I am. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, this has been another episode of Battle Plan for Broken Families. Many thanks to my guest, Lyndsey. And if you would like to learn more about Active Faith, you can find us at active